Hey everyone, and thank you for tuning into the very first episode of BioCurrent, the podcast where biology flows in real time. I'm your host, Dalton Sizemore, and today we're starting on a journey to explore biology. Now, this first set of episodes for this podcast will focus on talking about and understanding different elements of biology and why they all matter. In fact, in this first episode today, we're going to answer a question that's both simple and profound. How does your DNA make you, you? Now, you've probably heard people talk about DNA like it's some kind of magic code. But what is it really? And how can four little chemical letters, A, T, C, and G, be the reason why you have your mother's laugh, your dad's nose, or why cilantro tastes like soap to you but not your best friend? Buckle up, because we're going to go molecular, but we're going to keep it simple. So let's start here. Why does DNA even matter? Well, imagine that you're scrolling through some old family photos, and in those photos you come across a picture that shows your grandmother as a young woman, and she has the exact same eyes as you. And in the next photo, well, it's your dad with the exact same crooked smile that you see in the mirror every day. Now, we've all had moments like this, little flashes that make us wonder how much of who we are was actually written before we were even born. Or maybe you've done a DNA ancestry test and found out that you're 6% Finnish, and maybe you're related to a Viking chief. That's not just trivia that you've learned about yourself. It's a biological fingerprint linking you to stories thousands of years old. Now, our DNA holds clues about our health, our talents, our quirks, and even our connection to each other. And that's why we care about it. So now let's dive directly into the science, but we'll do it without any overly technical jargon, I promise. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and you can think of it as this large set of biological instructional material, one that's found in every single cell of your body, like a manual. Now, picture this. If your body were a city, DNA would be like the master plan. It tells each building, in our case, each cell, what to do and when to do it. DNA is made up of four so-called letters, A, T, C, and G. Now, those are just biochemical molecules that we call nucleotides, and they pair up in very, very specific ways. A, or adenine, always pairs up with T, or thymine, and C, which is cytosine, always pairs up with G, which is guanine. Now, think of all of that like Legos that only snaps together in certain pieces. The red always snaps together with blue, and the yellow always snaps together with green. Now, those biological letters form words, and those words form sentences, which are your genes, the instructions to make proteins in your body, which we'll talk about more in a second. Now, DNA in humans is extremely complex, and there's a ton of it. In fact, if you took your DNA from just one cell and stretched it out into one long, thin nucleotide line, it would be almost 6 foot long. Not only that, but when you multiply that by 37 trillion cells that make up the body, and that's enough DNA to wrap from here to the moon 300 times. So, how does that much DNA stay inside a structure that you normally would need a microscope to see? Well, it fits in your cells thanks to some very serious molecular origami. The DNA is wrapped around proteins called histones that heavily control access to it. They allow things to come in and express genes more often or suppress the expression of genes. So, Now we've got this long string of code that's intricately wrapped around the spools of histones. But how does that ultimately become you? Well, it all comes down to the proteins. Think of DNA as the recipe and the proteins as the final dish. Proteins will do almost everything: build your skin, digest your food, carry oxygen in your blood, and even fire off signals in your brain. As an example, hemoglobin is a protein in your red blood cells that actually carries oxygen directly from your lungs to all the cells throughout the rest of your body. While the protein is doing the work, the instructions to make that protein is written in your DNA. But what happens if DNA is a little slightly off? Well, you can end up with a condition like sickle cell anemia, where only one base, one of those ATCG letters, is off, causing a slightly different protein, but ultimately making red blood cells change their shape and preventing them from delivering that vital oxygen in an efficient and effective way. One single spelling error in the DNA, just one letter out of 3 billion, can cause that. Now imagine this multiplied across thousands of proteins, and that's how a bunch of molecules becomes everything from your heart to your hair, and how mutations in those proteins can affect everything from your heartbeat to your hair color. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting and personal. Out of all the DNA in your body, you share 99.9% of it with every other human being on the face of the earth. That other zero point 0.1 or so percent, well, that's the part that gives you your eye color, your height, your widow's peak, your love of spicy food, or your hate of cilantro, and can even give you higher risk of contracting diseases like atherosclerosis, which is the building of plaque that clogs the arteries of the heart, or even increase your risk of developing diseases like cancer. So we talked about how one DNA letter being off can cause a debilitating disease like sickle cell anemia. But sometimes it's more than just one gene that can contribute to something that's seemingly very minuscule. And for that, we'll take a look at eye color. But to tell you what laid the groundwork to figure all of this out was an Austrian monk in the 1800s by the name of Gregor Mendel. And he worked this in pea plants. Mendel actually figured out that he could predict 7 traits of the pea plants and offspring by breeding certain other pea plants together. His experiments were a lot more technical than that 2 sentences could describe, but remember, I did promise you guys that I'd keep it simple. So at the time, many natural scientists, as they were called then, or biologists as they're called today, believed that offspring were just a blended mix of the parents that would happen randomly without really any known cause behind it. But Mendel came in and showed that it's not just by random chance, that there's something, although he didn't know what it was at the time, that the parents were able to give to the children in predictable patterns. His work would unfortunately vanish before being rediscovered and reinvestigated by scientists in the mid 1900s, and those scientists would go on to figure out that it's through genes that are carried in chromosomes that traits are passed along from parents to children. So let's get back to the conversation about eye color. Let's talk about brown eyes versus blue eyes. That's the classic showdown, right? Now, in the genetics world, brown eyes are the bossy ones. It's what we call the dominant trait. And blue eyes, not so much. Blue eyes are a little more chill, what we call the recessive trait. So if a brown-eyed guy and a brown-eyed girl have a baby, most people would figure, yep, brown-eyed baby, obviously. But they would probably think along the same lines if 2 blue-eyed parents have a kid. They would assume the baby's going to be rocking those icy blues. But what if 2 brown-eyed parents have a blue-eyed baby? Is it time for everybody to start gossiping around the community? Should we go ahead and cue the dramatic music? Is it time to call Maury and ask who's the father? Well, hold up. Don't get so dramatic quite yet. Here's the deal. You get 2 copies of the eye color gene, one from mom, one from dad, and each copy is called an allele. And even if someone looks like they have brown eyes, they might still be carrying a sneaky little blue-eyed gene from one of their parents. So if both brown-eyed parents are secretly carrying a blue-eyed gene, there's a real chance, in fact a 25% chance, that they could pass that on, and boom, you've got a blue-eyed baby. No drama, no scandal, just genetics being sneaky and awesome. Another fun one, your ability to smell asparagus in your pee. Yep, we're gonna go there. Some people can, some people can't. That comes down to inheriting one allele from either parent that allows you to have that ability. Even more amazing than that, there are genes that are linked to musical ability, athleticism, and even how well you sleep. Now, we'll talk about in later episodes, genes are not truly your destiny. There are many more things that factor into that, but they do provide the framework. Back to our recipe example, it's like your DNA is your ingredients and your life is how you cook the meal. So we've laid the groundwork for this genetic recipe. But what about if you give someone the same recipe, but the meals turn out slightly different? In our case, we can talk about that in the context of identical twins. Twins that came from the same sperm and same egg and split off slightly before developing into 2 separate but identical embryos, and how they can turn out different. It's something called epigenetics. And epigenetics is like writing notes in the margins of your DNA cookbook. You're not really changing the actual base recipe. You're just tweaking which parts of it get read and when they get read. So a good example of this is researchers studying children that were born during the Dutch famine in World War II. Decades later, those now adults were much more likely to have health issues like obesity and heart disease. Why? Because their cells switched on genes while they were in the womb to survival mode, and those switches stayed flipped permanently. That's epigenetics in action, where your environment literally leaves a mark on your DNA expression, but it doesn't change the underlying DNA. It works by working on those histones that we talked about earlier, causing them to open or close, increase or decrease the expression of certain genes, allowing for someone to adapt to life. Another example, especially for myself and millions of others in the modern day, is stress. Chronic stress can literally change how certain genes related to inflammation are expressed, often increasing inflammatory gene products. So your mental health really can affect your physical health right down to the molecular level. This also explains why lifestyle choices like diet and exercise can turn on or off certain genes related to aging or disease. You are, in a very real sense, shaping the expression of your DNA story each and every day. So we've talked about the cool molecular science that's involved, but what is DNA doing for us out in the real world other than making us, well, us? So let's talk about forensics first. DNA fingerprinting revolutionized criminal justice. One tiny hair or one drop of saliva can now identify someone with 99.99 or greater % accuracy. Certain cases can be solved much faster by eliminating individuals or including individuals as suspects, and cold cases from decades ago are being solved, and innocent people are literally being freed after being falsely convicted of something they never did, thanks to DNA technology. Now, take medicine. There's a couple examples that I can give here. We can now screen for genes that are linked to terrible diseases like breast cancer and genes like BRCA1 or BRCA2, and allow those individuals and their physicians to take preventative action to prevent it from developing in the first place. Some people have even undergone life-saving treatments because of what their DNA revealed was the best course of treatment for them. Now, there's a secondary path in medicine, and that's called gene therapy. Now, here we're talking about editing the actual DNA within our cells to fix diseases at the genetic source. That means kids with immune disorders are being cured, and scientists are working on treatments for things like sickle cell or hemophilia, cystic fibrosis, cancers, and other diseases that start in the DNA. Now, let's not forget what makes this and other gene editing possible, and that was the discovery of CRISPR. Now, CRISPR we'll talk about in future episodes, but it's like molecular scissors that can cut and paste pieces of DNA. It's a powerful tool, but it's scary as well. It can become our greatest tool in fighting disease, but it could also become our worst enemy if not handled properly and ethically. And again, we'll talk about CRISPR and ethics more later on. So here's the big takeaway from this episode. Your DNA is not just a code. It's a living story, one that began long before you and will continue after you. It shapes you, but it doesn't define you. You are made from 3 billion letters of ancient evolving information, but you're more than that. You are made of choices. Every breath you take, every bite you eat, every night of good sleep or bad sleep, all of those things write the notes in the genetic margins. And that's what makes you you. And knowing that is powerful. So thank you so much for exploring the mystery of what makes you, you, with me. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe and tell others about it. Until then, take care and keep being uniquely you.